welcome back. A very good morning to you once again, and thank you for your patience. Now we are going to begin the first keynote speech of IAVAS 2022, which will be delivered by Professor Arjuna Parakrama. To introduce Professor Arjuna Parakrama, I cordially invite Director PGIE, Dr. Romola Razul. Madam, over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning. Professor Arjuna Parakrama, poet, scholar, and activist, has had over the last 30 years a distinguished academic career in Sri Lanka, and he has also done important work with the UN and major international organizations. He is currently the Professor of English and the Director of the Center for the Study of Human Rights at the University of Parakrama. As an interdisciplinary scholar working on critical discourse studies, subalternity, human rights and development, and radical sociolinguistics, he is the author of many essays, monographs, and books. Professor Parakrama believes that academic and activist work must mutually inform each other, and that neither is of any value unless it is combined with learning to learn from subaltern groups. Professor Parakrama identifies himself as a scholar and an activist, but according to him, the scholars consider him too much of an activist, and the activists consider him too much of a scholar. I, for one, enjoy watching Professor Parakrama as he gleefully positions himself and dances on that hyphen between scholar and activist. Over to you, Professor.
Good morning, everyone. Vice Chancellor, Professor Tilakaratne, Chair of the conference, Professor Virakon, Deans of the faculties, I'm sorry, I should have said Director, Postgraduate Institute of English, Deans of the faculties. Hierarchies always undo me. And friends and colleagues, I'm at that dangerous space in the twilight of my career where most people would like to see me go, and they're waiting for that moment. But at the same time, it empowers me to say some things which are possibly not very popular. I see my role today as trying to do precisely that. I want to talk to you about the serious issues that we face. I want to encourage you to contradict me, to argue with me, to fight with me, so that we can produce a kind of engagement that goes beyond the platitudes of our times. So I hope, I'm very privileged to be here, and I hope that you will not decide that you made the wrong choice after you hear me talk. My title is Resisting the Aftershock Dogma, Rejecting Neoliberal Economic Policy as the Engine of Change in Educational Principles and Practice. It's Peter Baker who wrote in The Guardian, disaster, and I quote, "Disasters and emergencies do not throw light on the world as it is. Disasters and emergencies do not just throw light on the world as it is. They also rip open the fabric of normality. Through the hole that opens up, we glimpse possibilities of other worlds. For governments looking to monitor their citizens even more closely, and companies looking to get rich by doing the same, it would be hard to imagine a more perfect crisis than a global pandemic." Close quote. Naomi Klein famously claimed in 2008 that, I quote, "neoliberal free market," unquote, "policies have come to dominate the contemporary world." This is important because they are smuggled in to so-called third world economies when the people of these countries are disaster shocked, and I would add crisis devastated, as in Sri Lanka today. The key understanding is that unpopular and even discriminatory political and economic policies are imposed on people when they are preoccupied with life and livelihood threatening crises. As Klein points out forcefully, the bigger the crisis, the greater the benefit to crisis business and crisis con artists, of which we don't have any dearth in this country. Naomi Klein says, quote, believers in the shock doctrine are convinced that only a great rupture, a flood, a war, a terrorist attack, and we have all those, can generate the kind of vast, clean canvas they crave. It is in these malleable moments when we are psychologically unmoored and physically uprooted that these artists of the real can produce their alternative dialogue. This is because facing hunger, deprivation, the disruption of normal life, the inability even to seek solace in religious rites and rituals, palpable fear of danger to family and loved ones, the people no longer, when they are faced with these, they no longer have the luxury to think carefully, to weigh the pros and cons. They do not even have time or energy to resist. Klein describes this well. She says, in moments of crisis, I quote, in moments of crisis, people are willing to hand over a great deal of power to anyone who claims to have a magic cure. And we can think, make a penny, right? Where the crisis is, whether the crisis is a financial meltdown or is in the Bush administration would later show a terrorist attack. So this is Klein in the book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. More importantly, however, this is me, is how such shocks and aftershocks are used to distort, devalue, and trash serious alternatives of an ethical nature. All this can be achieved in times of catastrophe by pointing the finger at such ethical and moral positions as if they were guilty of producing the crisis or the catastrophe, without even having to engage with any serious argumentation or evidence. That is the argument of the crisis. In a normal situation, you have to explain, this is bad for this reason, that reason. Now you have a crisis, say, privatize, do this, do something else, and there is no argument needed. Thus, the manipulation of crises preempts rationality and reasonable discourse, compounding the original disaster with an added catastrophe in the making. Common sense possessed by reasonable people, cherished beliefs of the general public, and so on, are at their weakest at such times. They are under stress, they are harassed, they have to be this queue and that, the next meal is not sure, so they are not in a position to bring in common sense or reason. And this very weakness is what is exploited. As Klein says, and there is evidence from all over the place. Not only this part, not only Asia. I'm quoting Klein again. I quote, the dirty secret of the neoliberal era is that these ideas, and by these ideas, I mean the combination of democracy and socialism, that these ideas were never defeated in a great battle of ideas. Nor were they voted down in elections. They were shocked out, and this is the word I keep coming, shock. They are shocked out of the way at key political junctures. When the resistance is fierce, they were defeated with overt violence. I make no obvious comparisons. You can make them yourself. But let's look at concrete specifics to understand the process better. Not many of you know that Klein's book has a long and significant chapter on the Asian tsunami with special reference to Sri Lanka. And she quotes, I quote her rather, quote, the tsunami that cleared the shoreline like a giant bulldozer has presented developers with an undreamed of opportunity, and they have moved quickly to seize it. We understand how in the wake of the tsunami, they had these buffer zones, as we all know, which were quickly created, but only for poor fisherfolk, right? So not for hotels. Quickly using this calamity to clean the beach of unauthorized structures. That is what they said. These are unauthorized structures, clean them away. and to remove fishing communities from their means of livelihood so that big business can use this prime land to build hotels in the buffer zone. This is what happened. So you can see how the disaster is used. Now, if they came and said, take these fisher folk away, there'd be a protest. But you use the calamity. That's the worst kind of thing to do. That's what the shock doctrine is, where you use a calamity, use a catastrophe to smuggle in things that you can't otherwise. Her description is based on a visit to the country 6 months after the tsunami. But it's not always accurate. This is the problem we have, that we have people, when they're scholars, they tend to make these, we call it in my technical area, we call it sanctioned ignorance. They make silly mistakes, even though the principle is right. And not every sector is affected the same way. This is a quotation from her. You can see a wonderful book, but nobody has pointed this out because after all, Sri Lanka is not important. Except to us, not even to us, I think. Right. I quote, the grand plan to remake Sri Lanka predated the tsunami by 2 years. This is a quotation. The grand plan to remake Sri Lanka predated tsunami by 2 years. It began when the civil war ended. So we do the math. 2009 is 2 years before 2004. I'm not a mathematician, but you can imagine what happened there, right? But of course, the next part is right. And the usual players descended on the country to plot Sri Lanka's entry into the world economy, most prominently USAID, the World Bank, and its offshoot, the Asian Development Bank. But let us understand, there is also the success, as outlined by Tara DeMel in her recent publication, Reforming Education, Challenges to Change. The reconstruction of schools after the tsunami was in most part building back better. Quickly and effectively, they rebuilt the 59 schools destroyed, the 117 partially damaged, and supported 107 more where the children required additional assistance. So the truth is always more complicated than the global theory. So as we know, not everything fits into the overarching model. I'm proposing a model, but there are exceptions, and we have to understand that, it seems. Thus, while reiterating the importance of Klein's path-breaking work, my contribution, articulated for the first time here and the first time anywhere, is to push this further and to critique the flatness and the uniformity of her idea of a disaster shock, or the shock doctrine. Here is my thesis. I argue that there are two distinct phases to this process of imposing unacceptable decisions of far-reaching long-term consequences on the public. First, we experience a decision made during the immediate crisis, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's the COVID, or whether it is the foreign exchange, or how you want to describe it, the corruption crisis, or shock situation that is extensively described by Klein. The first phase. So there is a disaster. This is what you do. You make the area from the beach a no-go zone, a buffer zone, and then you sell it to other people. Here you sell part of the country. So that particular initial process is clear. Second, we suffer through this is new. We suffer through the longer term aftershock period where the catastrophic consequences of the original crisis are combined with the ongoing repercussions. So we heap repercussions onto the ongoing crisis. These repercussions of state-imposed neoliberal policies deliberately misperceived as solutions. So we are told there is a problem, the solution is the IMF. Anybody does the math, you realize how 2.9 billion loan is not going to solve a 59 or 49 billion debt. But of course, if you understand, we come to a point where we accept everything. That's what happens, right? Note crucially here, and this is very important, it is not only policies that become saddled with, but also people. Politicians, bureaucrats, more politicians, sycophants, some of whom, alas, are academics, who then become the only people we have, the only options we have. As we pick A or B or C or D, even though we know they are all alike in one way or the other. So the policies are also smuggled in, the people are also smuggled in with those policies. So we can choose from everybody who is the same. On a scale of 1 to 10, they're all 1. right? But we pick this one opposed to that one, and then in 3 months they become something else and so on. It's Che Guevara who said, how did he say it? He said, we chase out corrupt leaders only to find new leaders become corrupt. It is during this second aftershock. So if I define it as shock, that's Klein, this is me. This second aftershock period that the fields of education and higher education are most adversely, even irrevocably affected. This debacle takes place in 4 distinct but interconnected ways. This is me. We have left Klein behind now. First of the 4, governments and their propaganda machines convince both the public and the experts that the crisis does not allow any other alternatives or alternative people at this point of time. So you have to pick up one of the 225, or you have to pick the IMF or the IMF, or if you want the IMF, right? So you are then convinced that these are the only alternatives. Hence, the government proposes a set of responses to the crisis that they have created, and thereafter makes this into a fait accompli, which all responsible academics must espouse and develop at the risk of appearing insensitive to palpable public need, as well as being seen as selfish and grossly impractical. So you're given one option as the only option, one set of people as the only set of people, and as academics, we have to respond, otherwise we are selfish and whatever, right? Specifically, we are coerced into the conviction that schools should be closed and university education should be conducted online, as if there is no other option. And for this, I am grateful to Mihiri Jans for pointing this out. But as I oppose this reduction of teaching to facts and information remotely dispensed linearly in lines of text online, as I keep saying, if you are in a field where you just have to list the number of causes of malaria or the number of cures, you don't need anything but online. But we teach judgments, we teach people to analyze, we teach students to understand. You can't do that online. At least I think you can't. So as I oppose the reduction, I realize, after Mihiri pointed it out, that even this formulation that is saying online is bad, privileging as it does conventional face-to-face teaching for all contexts, does not do justice to the nuanced ways in which online education, especially in relation to open and distance learning, can actually help to redress systemic inequalities as well. So the issues are very complex. I mean, I think in conventional universities, online issue has a problem. I'll come back to that. But there is also a way in which, a strange way, in online actually provides access to others as well. So here are examples of the first phase of the aftershock dogma, right? The example of the first phase can be seen in what I term, quote, the crisis in education, unquote. The discourse called the crisis in education, which was brought to a head by a head who didn't understand what education is all about. In reality, the crisis in education has as much to do with the fact that such confusions between employment and employability remain uncorrected. We are told that our graduates are not employable. That's not right. They're not employed, because employment has to do with the economy and various things. There's nothing to do with, or very little to do with the quality of the graduates. I'm not saying the quality of the graduates are good, but this is not the answer. Then we should be actually giving all this up and teaching masonry and carpentry, because those are the areas that have the highest employment and who receive the highest wage too. Justifiably, but nonetheless, so that has to do with the economy. Employment and employability are not the same. I don't think a university can provide employment. We can provide inter alia, not as our main thing, but employability. Right. So anyway, so the confusion between employment and employability remain uncorrected. That university education is measured in narrowly instrumental terms and not in terms of the value it imparts for citizens or for human beings, and that hardly anyone wished then or wishes now to expose the emperor's new clothes. New emperor, but same clothes, right? So the question is, who is going to bell the cat? right? Now we have a crisis here. Is the university designed to provide jobs? So in which case we should do something else. I think we can do two kinds of degrees. We can do one for the world of work and one which is to help people to think and to understand. Anyway, the tragedy is that there is a real disaster and travesty in education that has become one, but this narrow instrumentalist approach is merely obfuscatory. It's merely a red herring. The idea that our university education is failing because we don't provide them to enter the job market. Now the job market has nothing to do with this. I will give you one example. I'm digressing, but just so that you understand the point. I had a student. I have very good politically aware students. Went for an interview at one of the blue chip companies a few years ago. And these old boys in ties and suits, the present company accepted, were there, and they sort of, you could see this was the token person from village area who was brought. Everybody else was somebody's son or daughter, or the old school tie, and so on. They asked him, "What's the capital of France?" He said, "London." So they sniggered and they laughed and they sort of looked at each other. Balapanko, this is the level of our university education, etc., etc. And so then he answered, and then before that he said, "Okay, so now they finished interview in about 3 minutes flat. They have to now, so and so son is coming next." And then, so he's a good student, as I said. We don't have many students like that. He said, "May I ask you a question?" I said, "Yes." "If I had answered Paris, would you have given me the job?" So the question is, it is not the answer, but the question is an insult. The question means you're not a serious applicant. You're not a serious candidate. So I think this question of employability is something that we need to look at, right? So the instrumentalist approach to education is something that is now saddled on us, and we have now to accept it. It's part of the shock thing, series of shocks. Earlier, we would not have tolerated this at all. We'd say, no, we are doing something else. And if you remember the old systems, they look for a first class. It didn't matter whether it was in mathematics or classics. First class showed you had a first class mind, and your mind was trained. Anyway, hence a clear example, and this is where I'm going to upset some people, I hope. The key example here is the entire quality assurance dogma, which all universities under the UGC's blindly watchful eye, in other words, they haven't a clue, are committed to implement. I have written in detail elsewhere about the subject, showing that the subject, program, and institutional review processes merely serve to reinforce self-seeking and mutual back-scratching, for which they use the most mindless and superficial criteria and evidence. So you approve me, I approve you, we get somebody else, and so on. It's a whole network. The false competition generated by this, the actual time wasted in preparation for it, in short, the entire process itself is deeply problematic and flawed. Even when universities are closed, we are busy preparing to do better than our colleagues in other universities. The simple dictum is that documentation is more important than actual work. Right? I was told you went on a field visit, was very important, but where's the documentation? Did you get the grammar there to sign? Did somebody else sign? Where's the passport? There is no conceptual framework, no theory of change. For instance, students are interviewed about the programs. This happened in Peradeniya. And those who have become empowered, we try to empower our students, and articulate enough to provide constructive commentaries on their programs, are used as evidence that these programs are deficient. Because our students were critical. Oh my God, your students are critical, your program is horrible. Whereas if students passively claim that their programs are wonderful, and they do that because due to the absence of safe space or an enabling environment, they are seen as products of exemplary programs. As I say, if you have a good gender program, you should have lots of complaints. We were discussing the whole sexual harassment issue. The fact that there are no complaints or few complaints means that the program is a failure. There have to be complaints and they have to be addressed. They are not, it means the students are too scared and junior colleagues are too scared to talk about it. But we have this silly notion, like this positivist notion. Okay. In the first phase, faculty boards, senates, and others debated the underlying issues related to quality and quality assurance. This lasted until 2019 or so, up to which time there was significant resistance. Veeradeniya refused. I'm sure others said this is nonsense. After that, we just gave up, gave in, threw in the towel. You can think of any other idioms that you want. Only in the second phase, to become the champions of the charade. So now we have, in the first phase, we sort of resisted, then we gave up. Now we are the champions, right? But that's the first phase, which quickly morphs and seeps into the second phase. So let's understand what happens in phase 2. Second phase. You remember the first one is where we are told there are no other alternatives. You got to do this. Second, the government identifies selected experts and other champions. I hope some of you are blushing, as urgently required to step up to the plate during this hour of need and to assist the nation in the recovery process. Those who raise principled and fundamental objections are ridiculed as irrelevant or maligned as pawns in political games. The simple fact that online higher education further excludes rural poor students from the right to learn, since power cuts, signal failures, the lack of computers or smartphones have catastrophic consequences for them, as well as for many other non-elite users, exacerbated by economic destitution, is thus ignored. So we now say, which kind of online do you want? Is it Zoom or is it some other team thing or something else? So how do you do it? Now those are the, so we now have hours of discussion whether it's going to be, Google Classroom or it is Zoom. We have forgotten the point that you're leaving out so many students. Moreover, within a neoliberal framing of education as a financial investment, we hear that all the time. We heard it today too. Such sections of society are dispensable. How convenient that the pandemic and the crisis helped to achieve this objective of eliminating what are seen to be non-viable students, sans widespread public opposition due to the aftershock dogma. This is what I call the aftershock dogma. Thus, the gendered income poor, the vulnerable and the marginalized students become collateral damage, and we move on after a show of wringing our hands. We had the staff meeting saying, "Ayo, we are losing many of our students," and then we decide on should it be Google or something else, or it should be Tuesday morning or something. And then, so examples of the second phase of aftershock dogma. So we have the shock doctrine and what I call the aftershock dogma, because to flatten it as one, these are very clear phases that happen and we are complicitous with it. In the conventional universities, well over 1/3 of students, more in the humanities and social science faculties, have serious difficulties accessing online classes due to lack of adequate resources, such as dedicated smartphones. They may have a smartphone, but it's for the whole family, right? Cost of internet services, signal non-availability, irregularity, power cuts, and general economic poverty repercussions. Yet we continue to teach in this mode, thereby selecting whom we know will drop out or undergo severe stress. We do that, and there is no excuse for it. We know that when we do this, we leave them out. I had a class where I teach some monks, and I scolded this monk saying, what is this, you're paying attention? Ape sir, banin nepa. Mami dangahවට නැගලා ඉන්නේ වහිනෝ මේ තව ටිකෙන් ලිස්සල වැටෙයි සිවුරත් හොඳට තෙමිලා අනේස බනින්නම් එපා, right? So then I realized that is the kind of situation that they're in. So we decide, we remember that when we choose this, not in your situation, maybe in ours, we are deliberately leaving out a group as dispensable, which is going back to the neoliberal thing, which is education's investment. Now, all of you don't need much savvy to know that if health is an investment, I'm not a good investment. I think they should not waste a lot of money giving me the heart treatment I need and various things, because I'm a lost cause. Same way, you decide that these poor students, these underprivileged students, that's how neoliberalism creeps into this. I'll have more on that. So yet we continue to teach the mode, thereby selecting whom we know will drop out or undergo severe stress. There seems to be no moral or ethical issue anymore. Where is the ethical issue? Where are we debating this? No, in that second phase, we have become champions, or we're doing the best we can, or we have accepted the first phase, which is there is no other alternative. And when you think about it, there is no other alternative to the IMF. It is inevitable, natural, it can't be helped. We say, let's focus on the positives. That is now we are in the second phase. Third phase. Proposals are advanced and validated, all based on the premise that the solution to the crisis can only be found within the established framework of the neoliberal economic response proposed by the IMF, World Bank, Sri Lankan government nexus. So the proposals now are only within this neoliberal frame. We are manipulated into forgetting our differences and uniting for the common good, which is eliminate those who are dispensable. Bad investment, don't invest. I'm told by people, anyway, so many students drop out and they're poor and then whatever it is, so let's go on with this. How can we be unfair by the not so poor students? So what is being garbage there is free education. We find, therefore, the best ways of providing an inadequate and fundamentally flawed educational experience. To quote myself, misquoting Wittgenstein, I quote, a crack is showing in the organic unity of university education, and one tries to stuff it with straw. We're not redoing the foundation, we are stuffing it with straw. But to quieten one's conscience, we use only the best straw. That's what we're doing, using the best straw rather than redoing the foundation. If we are to remove the blinkers imposed by the aftershock doctrine, this already failed attempt at teaching learning in absentia becomes both futile and frustrating. Our energy must be better spent to forge a new path out of this mess, which is rights-based, structurally excludes no one, is pragmatic while retaining its idealist core. So here are examples of the third phase of the aftershock doctrine. Now in the second and third phases, we have been aftershocked out of this. We just accept quality assurance and carry on as if there is no other option. See the following, for instance. University of Peradeniya approved by the Senate in January 21, by the Council on the 27th of February. And this is part of a UGC thing, so you probably have it as well. Definition of quality. Now we are all full of quality assurance. I'm sure that you have quality assurance cells coming out of your eyeballs here, right? I quote, this is the quality. The fitness of purpose of a product or service according to a set of required standards with minimum cost to society, unquote. This is the manual for institutional program review, etc. Now, don't you see the catch here? This is a neoliberal. Minimum cost to society. So what is the key determiner here? Cost. So this is, how did cost become the key factor, overriding everything else? It is obvious to anyone who's not under shock therapy, but we are all under this, that minimum cost should be replaced by appropriate cost. Because if it's minimum cost, why has this not been changed in the last 10 years of discussion? Because we are in the third phase and we no longer question these things. The questioners are seen as radical and extremist because academics have been tamed by the aftershock dogma and can no longer, as a community, think outside this externally imposed normal. The outcome is that, to our collective shame, this has not been seriously questioned or even critiqued. The system ignores this and continues on its merry way, increasing class size, reducing basic resources, including teachers, all can be justified minimum cost. So if you teach English, you can now increase the class to 100 minimum cost. If you think it costs you 1 year to produce to do clinicals for medicine, you can do it 6 months, minimum cost. So how has this gone past us? How can cost be the determiner of quality? Yes, it can if it's an investment. If you can produce doctors who kill only 15% of their patients, that's still a good figure because 85% of ordinary human illnesses cure themselves. So the doctor is in danger only with the other 15%. I would like to be in a profession where only 15% is my issue. But the question there is minimum cost. And collectively, are you saying the 5,000 academics in this term have been blind to this? We raised it, but it has come back. Because minimum cost is the determiner. What can you do cheaply? So I guess online is cheaper. Then you can dispense with staff also somewhere down the line and have one teacher for 1,000 students. And so on. No, you don't even need a teacher. You just do consultancies, record lectures. I'm reminded of the story in the US where student was giving a class, and then lecturer was giving a class, and one of the students said, look, I can't come today, can I record it? And had left the recorder on the table. So the lecturer said, fine. Then 2 days later, there were 3 recorders and about 4 students and the lecturer. 2 weeks later, there was 1 recorder at the teacher's table and about 15 recorders on the other side. So the teaching had become, that's your online for you, right? Right. So here's a definition that is equally problematic. This is again, and it's sophomoric. It's like, I don't know what to say. Have we seriously descended this level of quasi-religious quality, what I call gobbledygook? And gobbledygook is an onomatopic word. Gobbledygook means rubbish, and it is rubbish. Here's a definition of quality assurance. This is from the Quality Assurance Handbook, which is echoed by, I'll listen to this. You will not believe me. It says, quality assurance is, I quote, the persistent pursuit of goodness coupled tightly with the simultaneous relentless avoidance of badness and enhancing the fitness for purpose. And what the hell is that? Sounds like some religious catechism. The persistence of goodness and the avoidance of badness. Now, this is our official document. But we are now past that stage. We are now at the champions and implementing stage. Now for the 4th and final subphase. 4th and coming back full cycle, a consensus has been built that the predicament and its solution are givens, which cannot be usefully contested. And on the basis of this scenario, the proposed changes in education in this instance must be implemented expeditiously and unquestioningly if we are to collectively mitigate the crisis for present and future generation. Now the story goes, problem is there, solution is there, nothing we can do, we have to implement this, which is what we are doing now. We are therefore stuck between the metaphorical devil and the deep blue sea, forced to choose among options that are all unacceptable. We shake our collective head and bemoan our fate as we passively participate in ways of teaching without contact, denying free education again and again. What neoliberal policies and World Bank directives could not hitherto accomplish due to public outrage, the quote, new normal has done for us, against us. Hence, by this stage, we have bought into the doctrine that expenditure for higher education needs to be drastically reduced, and we manage the best we can. So the greatest amongst us will teach double the load, or we'll have a class that is much higher, or we'll manage without TAs and so on. Is that the best? Or should we be fighting for something else? So examples of the 4th phase of aftershock dogma, and this is particularly for my friend Rohan, one of the things that goes is 6% for GDP is no longer even discussed anymore. Reduced funding, no appointments, even where there is an approved cadre position, no filling vacancies in the higher education sector. We wring our collective hands in despair and soldier on. I use the metaphor deliberately, of course, because 350,000 in the armed forces don't have any real work. They are paid higher salaries than our graduates. Their budgets are increasing, but we say nothing. No one says anything. We are convinced that natural disasters and pandemics such as the tsunami and COVID-19 are beyond our control, and we have to do the best we can in the face of these crises. I have something to say about that. The authorities are never to blame. But there is nothing at all natural about natural disasters and pandemics if those who are worst affected are the poor, the marginalized, the old and infirm, women, children, minorities, again and again and again. What is natural about that? The landslide affects the poor. The flooding affects the poorest. The education crisis affects the poorest. The pandemics affects the poorest. So what's natural about that? Increased student intake combined with diminished resources, staff, classroom, lab space, library facilities, books, computers, hostels. So we take all this. We have arguments with the UGC about giving us 5 more, they give us 25. And then there's other issues. Student bursaries and scholarships are not paid. Costs have spiraled. Even staff has huge financial and other constraints, but we say nothing. We teach students in times of repression, injustice, and worse, but we say nothing. We say nothing about this. Though unjust and skewed increased taxes, we have a lot to say. We become apoplectic when the taxes affect us. My point is that one without the other means that we have already subscribed to the 4th phase of the aftershock dogma. I argue, therefore, that the terminology of the hour, such as new or next normal and smart future, are part of the problem of the insidious predation of our values and beliefs through the aftershock dogma process, which is based on dubious premises and privileges the status quo. Language is never neutral. The historical and contemporary provenance of words present a palimpsest of the social values that they both reveal and cover over as we use them. For instance, the word credit. I'll give you an example so that you understand. The word credit followed, I quote, a semantic trajectory from religious belief and trust to trustworthiness in general, and then to quantifiable monetary worth, which clearly reflects the overall shift in emphasis from the extra-economic to the economic coding of value from use to exchange value, and which leads to transformation of the concept's primary meaning from value in general, credit meant value in general, right? With an emphasis on the ethical. It was ethical. You were to be creditable, to have credit means you were courageous, you were valuable. This was in the 15th century, 16th century. Now it means how much money you have. So there is now a technical evaluation of monetary worth. It would not be too much of a stretch to argue that the trajectory of the narrowing meaning of credit, together with semantically similar words such as worth, reflect the reductive economization of value itself. In our context too, we see how urgent education reform is represented as servile alignment with a neoliberal market. So education is now also becoming like that. Education means employment or employability or something. Analogously, it is well known in the discussion of the new and next normality that this is predicated on the COVID pandemic context, whereas in Sri Lanka, the pandemic situation is no longer taking center stage as we suffer the simultaneous explosion of a 4-fold economic, political, social, and ideological web of crises. Our challenge is to undo the Western pandemic-oriented notions of normality without wearing neoliberal spectacles. To innovate appropriate pedagogical responses, radical alternatives, such as those practiced by Paulo Freire, Sri Aurobindo, Jiddu Krishnamurti, to name only 3 among many, require our careful attention now. So quality, we must look at that again, not about cost. Not new wine in old bottles or old wine in new bottles, but let us see these things for the first time again. So the examples from business discourse relating to the new or the next normal, because we get swallowed into this and we think we're doing something great when we now try to locate the next norm. The phrase the next normal was coined, as you know, by McKinsey and Company, I quote, a global management consultancy firm founded in 1926, which is the oldest and biggest of the big three largest strategic consultancy firms in the world. While the phrase is manifestly corporate, so we want to be corporate. That's part of the neoliberal thing. The fact that McKinsey, the founders of this term, has been embroiled in more than its fair share of scandals and controversies creates further cause for concern about the concept. The concept is launched by a fairly well-known fraudulent giant in the field of this corporate exploitation of the third world. So why are we taking the term on? Language is not neutral. If we take somebody else's term, we take that history. As I have been at pains to point out, our language is not innocent, our words are not pure. Within them lies both a history and a geography of struggle for and against oppression, whether it be ideological, political, or economic. If we borrow our keywords from business, our epistemology will be from that domain. When we accept these concepts such as quality and normality uncritically as denizens of the world of commerce, we will be left with meaningless, even misleading quantitative measures of value that will doom us to be pawns in a game over which we have no control. All teaching always also involves the teaching of value, whether we choose to or not. Hence, the easy normal, which excludes and instrumentalizes, which forgets that education is a right to be enjoyed by all, which thrives on an uneven playing field, which equates education with employment, which rationalizes inequality on the basis of the aftershock dogma, must be unequivocally rejected. In this stead, we must reconceptualize our transformative teaching role in this time of multiple crises that prepares us to learn from our predicament, as if we are seeing this for the first time, unburdened by the baggage of ideology and the bewitchment of the 4 phases of the aftershock. I have no formula to offer except the rejection of hand-me-down formulas from business speak and IT discourse. Instead, I invite you to reinvent, reformulate, and reconceptualize how best we can use this crisis to clear a new path, seeing afresh as strangers in our own land, focusing on the most subaltern of our students always and relentlessly. Focus on the most subaltern of your students, not the best. We need to reject the straitjacket of archaic business models of efficiency that with the World Bank agree that small schools of under 100 students, for instance, should be phased out and these students sent to larger schools nearby. This is not the solution that sees education for all as a right, since there are very good reasons why these schools cater to small, vulnerable and marginalized, stigmatized populations in remote for us, not for them, areas. Actually, there is a better argument of phasing out Royal College, Colombo, judging from its production unfair centralization of resources, than phasing out small schools. We know there's a school in Gampola, 8 students, but because that school is undercaste students in that school, they are not allowed to go to the other schools. The people around them won't come there. So can you see, if it's an efficiency model, then you don't need this. Dispense with those 8. If they don't, let them do whatever they want to do. We want to cater to, the best student. Crises are double-edged. On the one hand, they permit the regime to impose shock and aftershock policies and processes that we would never agree to normally. On the other, they force us to see things differently, to think anew. As Victor of St. Hugo said 1,000 years ago, to see our own terrain as strangers do. That is my invitation. Treat as strangers do. But for this, we must have the courage of our convictions. This is what I wish for you, for us, and for us today. The wisdom to see beyond the shock and aftershock dogma, the will to resist being cogs in a neoliberal wheel, and the courage to clear a new path. With Shakespeare, let me propose that our task is onerous, difficult, drastic. Rather than subject ourselves to the external shocks and aftershocks of outrageous fortune, let us commit to reversing roles and preempting the system. Let us then resolve, as Shakespeare said, come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arjuna Parakrama, for your keynote address. I'm sure you gave lots of opportunities for reflection upon your physical as well as the online audience. Thank you very much. For our audiences, online audiences, please stay on this link for 5 minutes and we will begin the first ODL session of iHours 2022. Thank you.